Chapter 10. Clara. When he was 23, Paul sent in a painting to the winter exhibition at the Castle Museum. One morning, the postman came when Mrs. Morell was doing the washing. Suddenly, Paul heard a wild noise from his mother. Rushing into the kitchen, he found her screaming and waving a letter, as if she had gone mad. The postman, too, came running back, afraid something bad had happened. "His picture's got first prize, Fred," she cried. "And it's been sold for £20. "That looks like meaning something," said the young postman. "Didn't I say we would do it?" she said, pretending she was not crying. Morell was greatly impressed.
£20? For a bit of a painting that took him just an hour or two?" he said, amazed. "Yes, and that other boy would have done as much, if they hadn't killed him," he added quietly.
The thought of William went through Mrs. Morell like a sharp knife. Arthur left the army and immediately got married to Beatrice, whom he had known for years. The baby was born 6 months after the wedding. With the help of Beatrice's mother, Mrs. Morell found furniture for a little 2-room house. He was caught now. For a while he refused to settle down and got annoyed with his young wife, who loved him. He nearly went mad when the baby cried or gave trouble. He complained for hours to his mother, who only said, "Well, my son, you did it yourself. Now you must make the best of it." And then the stronger side of his character appeared. He accepted his responsibilities, recognized that he belonged to his wife and child, and made a good job of it. The months passed slowly. One day, a friend of Clara's in Bestwood asked Paul to take a message to Mrs. Dawes. In the evening after work, he went to the house where she lived with her mother. The street was poor, and the paint on the front door was old. A large, fat woman of about 60 answered his knock. This was Mrs. Radford, Clara's mother. In a moment, Clara appeared. Her face went red. She seemed embarrassed that he had discovered her at home like this. She invited him into the kitchen, where the two women spent all their time making lace. The room was full of the white, snowy stuff. Clara gave him a chair, brought him a beer, and went on with her work. Her arm moved mechanically as she used the machine. Her head was bent over the lace. Her life seemed so narrow, so limited, Paul thought. Her grey eyes at last met his. He recognized that she was deeply unhappy, a kind of prisoner. He felt shaken. It was not what he had expected. She had seemed so high and proud. He left in a kind of dream. The girl in charge of the stocking department at Jordan's was leaving to get married. He told Clara about the vacant position, so Clara came back to Jordan's. Now they were fellow workers and saw each other several times a day. When Paul was painting in the afternoon, she often came and stood near him, keeping perfectly still. Although she stood a yard away, he felt as if she was pressed against him, and he was full of her warmth. Then he could paint no more. He threw down the brushes and began to talk. On Paul's birthday, he met Clara by chance in the dinner hour. They decided to go together up to the castle. At the top, they leaned over the wall. Away at the foot of the rock, tiny trees stood in their own pools of shadow, and tiny people went rushing about with amusing self-importance. She disliked towns. Clara told him, "When things are natural, they're beautiful." "And what isn't natural?" asked Paul. "Everything man has made," she answered, "including man himself." "But
His women made him, he remarked. Wasn't Baxter Dawes natural? She changed colour and looked away from him. We will not discuss it, she said. Later that afternoon, the postman brought Paul a small packet. It was a book of poems with a note inside. Please allow me to send you this. I am sympathetic to your problems and wish you well. C.D. Paul felt deeply moved and warm towards her. After this, they often went out together in the dinner hour. Paul asked her about Dawes. How old were you when you married? 22. That was 8 years ago. Yes. And when did you leave him? 3 years ago. 5 years together. Did you love him when you married him? I thought I did. More or less. I didn't think much about it. He wanted me. And why did you leave him finally? Because he was unfaithful to me. I believe he still loves you, said Paul. Probably, she replied. She was a married woman and believed in simple friendship. Paul considered that he was behaving quite correctly towards her. It was only a friendship between man and woman, such as any sensible people might have. It seemed to him quite plain. Miriam was his old friend and lover. She belonged to Bestwood and home, and his growing up. Clara was a newer friend, and she belonged to Nottingham, to life, to the world. Clara rarely saw Miriam now. They were still friends, but the friendship was much weakened. Will you come to the concert on Sunday? Clara asked Paul just after Christmas. I promised to go up to Willey Farm, he replied. You're not upset, are you? Why should I be? She answered. Again, Paul found himself telling her about Miriam. She wants me so much that I can't give myself. She wants the soul out of my body. And yet you love her? Asked Clara. No, I don't love her. I never even kiss her. Why not? Clara asked. I don't know. I suppose you're afraid. Anyway, she doesn't want to have your soul. That's your imagination. She wants you. He thought about this. Perhaps he was wrong. But she seems... he began. You've never tried. Chapter 11, she answered. The test on Miriam. With the spring, the old madness came back to Paul. He did not feel he wanted marriage with Miriam, and yet he wanted to belong to her. It was a powerful need, struggling with a still stronger shyness. He had a great tenderness for Miriam. He could not fail her. Mrs. Morell saw him going back to Miriam and was amazed. He said nothing to his mother. He did not explain or excuse himself. If he came home late and she made a comment, he answered coldly, I shall come home when I like. I'm old enough. And his mother went to bed, leaving the door unlocked for him. But she lay awake listening until he came, often long after. It was a great bitterness to her that he had gone back to Miriam. That summer, the cherry trees at the farm were heavy with fruit. They stood very tall, hung thick with bright red and dark red drops. Paul and Edgar were gathering the fruit one evening. It had been a hot day, and now the clouds were rolling in the sky, dark and warm. The wind made the whole tree swing with a thrilling movement that excited Paul. He sat unsteadily among the higher branches, feeling slightly drunk with the tree's movement, and tore off handful after handful of the smooth, cool fruit. Cherries touched his ears and neck as he leaned forward,
Red-coloured fruit glowed under the darkness of the leaves. The sun going down caught the broken clouds. Enormous piles of gold shone out in the southeast. The world, until now grey, was bathed by the golden glow, making trees and grass and far-off water shine. Miriam came out to watch.
"Oh,"
Paul heard her call.
"Isn't it wonderful?"
He looked down. There was a pale light on the soft face turned up to him.
"How high you are,"
she said. He threw a handful of cherries at her. She was taken by surprise and was afraid. He laughed and rained more cherries down on her. She ran off to escape them, picking up some cherries on the way. She hung 2 fine pears over her ears, then looked up again.
"Haven't you got enough?"
she asked. "Nearly. It's like being on a ship up here."
"How long will you stay?"
"Till the sunset ends." She watched the gold clouds turn to orange, then rose, then reddish-purple, until the passion went out of the sky. Paul climbed down with his basket.
"They're lovely,"
said Miriam, feeling the cherries. "I've torn my sleeve," said Paul. It was near the shoulder. She put her fingers through the tear.
"How warm,"
she said. He laughed. There was a strange, new sound in his voice. "Shall we walk a little way?" he said. They went down the fields as far as a thick wood. "Shall we go in among the trees?" he asked.
"Do you want to?"
"Yes." It was very dark in the wood. She was afraid. Paul was silent and strange. He seemed hardly conscious of her as a person. To him, she was only a woman. He stood against a tree and took her in his arms. She gave herself to him, but as a victim, feeling some sort of horror. This thick-voiced man was a stranger to her. Later, it began to rain. Paul lay with his head on the ground, listening to the sharp sound of the raindrops. His heart was heavy. He realized that she had not been with him, that her soul had stood back. His body felt calmer, but that was all. She put her hands over him to feel if he was getting wet. "We must go," said Miriam. "Yes," said Paul, but did not move.
"The rain is coming in on us,"
said Miriam. He rose and helped her up. They walked hand in hand. In a while, they went indoors. They made love a number of times after this. Afterwards, Paul always had the feeling of failure and death. "You don't really want me when I come to you," said Paul gloomily after a week or two.
"No, don't say so,"
she said, taking his head in her arms.
"Don't I want your children?"
"Shall we get married then?" said Paul.
"We're too young,"
she said after a pause.
"Not yet."
With Paul, the sense of failure grew stronger. At first, it was only a sadness. Then he began to feel he could not go on. He wanted to run, go abroad, anything. Gradually, he stopped asking her to have him. He realized consciously that it was no good. He told his mother that he would break off with Miriam. On Sunday, he went up to the farm in the early afternoon. Miriam met him at the end of the farm road. She was wearing a new dress with short sleeves. She had made herself look so beautiful and fresh for him. They sat down. He lay with his head on her breast, while she stroked his hair. She knew that he was somehow absent. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "We ought to break it off."
"What?"
she cried in surprise. "Because it's no good going on. I want us to break off. You to be free of me, I free of you."
"How many times have you offered to marry me and I wasn't willing?"
"I know. But I want us to break off."
"You're a child of 4,
she said in her anger.
"And what can I tell my mother?"
she asked. I told my mother that I was breaking it off. Cleanly and completely, he said.
"I shan't tell them at home,"
she said.
"It's always been the same. One long battle between us. You fighting me off."
"Not always. Not at first," he argued.
"Always. From the very beginning. Always the same."
He sat in silence. His heart was hard against her. He left her at the road end. As she went home alone, in her new dress, having to face her family at the other end, he stood without moving on the high road, filled with pain
Chapter 12.
and shame. Passion. After leaving Miriam, Paul turned almost immediately to Clara. One evening, they went to the cinema, and he took her hand in his. She neither moved nor made any sign. On Saturday evening, he invited her to have coffee with him after work. Afterwards, they walked for a little in the park, and in the darkness, he caught her suddenly in his arms and kissed her. For the whole of the next day, he only thought of seeing her again. Monday was his half day at work. He asked her if she would come out with him. They agreed to meet at 2:30. In the bus, she leaned against him, and he took her hand. They got out beside the river and crossed the bridge. They walked along the path above the river and came to a locked gate. Paul climbed over first. Then Clara climbed up onto it, and he held both her hands. Laughing, she looked down into his face. Then she jumped. Her breast came against his. He held her and covered her face with kisses. They decided to go down to the river's edge below. Slipping and sliding, they made their way to the bottom of the steep, wooded bank. Paul found a flat place at the foot of 2 trees. It was covered with wet leaves, but it would do. He threw down his raincoat and waved to her to come. She sank down at his side. He pressed his lips to her throat and felt the beat of her blood under his lips. Everything was perfectly still. There was nothing in the afternoon but themselves. They had a steep climb to get back to the public path at the top. Then they walked into Clifton and had tea at a guest house. He was madly in love with her now. Every movement she made, every fold in her clothes sent a thrill through him. Mrs. Morell was sitting reading when he got home. "You're late?" she said, looking at him. His eyes were shining. His face seemed to glow. "Yes. I've been down at Clifton Grove with Clara. She's awfully nice, Mother. Would you like to know her?" "Yes," said Mrs. Morell coolly. "I should like to know what she's like." "You don't expect to like her," said Paul. "I'll bring her here on Sunday for tea. Shall I bring her?" "You please yourself," said Mrs. Morell, laughing. Paul knew that he had won. He mentioned to Miriam that Clara was coming to tea on Sunday. "I want my mother to meet her," he added. "Ah." There was a silence. "I may call in before I go to the church service," Miriam said. "It's a long time since I saw Clara." "Very well," said Paul, surprised, and unconsciously angry. On a Sunday afternoon, Paul met Clara at Keston Station. Clara followed Paul into the house. Mrs. Morell rose. The younger woman was very nervous.
"I hope you don't mind my coming," she said hesitatingly.
"I was pleased when Paul said he would bring you," replied Mrs. Morell. Looking at Paul, she thought what a man he looked in his dark, well-made clothes. Her heart glowed. She and Clara started talking about Nottingham. Clara still rather nervous, Mrs. Morell still rather proud. But they were getting on well together, Paul saw. Mrs. Morell measured herself against the younger woman and found herself easily the stronger. Clara was very respectful. She knew how highly Paul thought of his mother, and she had been fearful of this meeting, expecting someone hard and cold. She was surprised to find this little, interested woman chatting so easily with her. At tea, the atmosphere was cool and clear, where everyone was themselves and in tune with the others. Afterwards, Paul cleared the table, then walked into the garden, leaving the two women to talk. Clara offered to help wash the dishes, and was allowed to dry the tea things. It was painful for her not to be able to follow him into the garden, but at last she allowed herself to go. She went to Paul, who was watching the bees among the autumn flowers. At that moment, Miriam was entering through the garden gate. She saw Clara go up to Paul, saw him turn, and saw them move together. Something in the relationship told her that they were already a couple. They were looking into each other's eyes, laughing. At that moment, they became conscious of Miriam, and everything changed. Miriam shook hands with Clara, saying, "It seems strange to see you here."
"Yes," replied the other. "It seems strange to be here."
There was a pause.
"It is pretty, isn't it?" said Miriam.
"I like it very much," said Clara. Then Miriam realized that Clara was accepted here as she could never be. She asked Paul for a book to read. He ran indoors to find one. When he returned, Clara turned to go indoors, leaving him to walk with Miriam to the gate.
"When will you come to Willey Farm?"
Miriam called to her.
"I couldn't say,"
replied Clara.
"Mother asked me to say she'd be pleased to see you any time." "Thank you, but I can't say when."
"Oh, very well," said Miriam with some bitterness, and left. That evening, the lovers went out over the fields. Clara leaned against him as they walked, and he held her closer and closer. Suddenly Paul's blood flamed up in him. He caught her in his arms and kissed her again and again. But she was worried about catching her train. They had only 14 minutes to get to the station, so they ran madly through the darkness. Away to the right, they could see the lit-up train approaching. At last, Clara fell into the train, completely out of breath. The whistle blew. She was gone. Before he knew where he was, he found himself back home in the kitchen.
"Do you like her?"
he asked his mother, rather unwillingly.
"Yes, I like her." "But you'll get tired of her, my son. You know you will. You better take some hot milk."
He refused and went to bed, feeling confused and angry.